So for some folks that haven't seen an interview of yours, I think you did some stuff with the folks at Library of Congress and other interviews you've done. What happened in with the Great Influenza? If you want to kind of walk us through with the story and some of the stats so the audience can come up to date.
Oh, an animal virus, all influenza viruses are actually bird viruses. They all start in birds. So in a sense, they're all bird flu, but obviously they circulate in mammals. And a new bird virus jumped species to humans. We hadn't seen it before, or at least most hadn't seen before. There are 8 gene segments in influenza. 7 of them came directly from birds. It may have passed through another mammal before it got to humans on the 8th. It spread worldwide very rapidly. You don't need airplanes to have a pandemic. There were pandemics that made it from Africa to Asia to Europe, even to the Americas, going back into the 1600s. It infected the 1918 virus infected about a third of the world's population. It was much, much deadlier than COVID-19. And it killed between 50 and, according to a Nobel laureate, made this estimate in the 1940s, and it's been confirmed by modern epidemiologists, probably between 50 and 100 million people died. Obviously, that's a big range. If you adjust for population, the world back then was less than a quarter the size of today's world. So that would be equivalent to 225 to 450 million people dead today. So the worst case scenarios for COVID-19, nothing like that. Thank God. So that virus was much more virulent. It also killed these people in an incredibly compressed period of time. Probably 2/3 of the dead died in the fall of 1918. The pandemic stretched over a couple of years. And in a particular city, it was even faster than that. It would probably be 6 to 10 weeks. Most of the people who died were adults between the ages of 18 and 45 or 50, probably about 2/3 of the dead. So that's very different from COVID-19 and very different from ordinary influenza. Possibly as many as 8% of the world's population, this would be on the worst case, of people in the age group, that age group died in a matter of weeks. So it was pretty violent. And the Western world was at war. And because of the war, every government that was fighting was focused entirely on the war. And for that reason, governments tended to minimize the pandemic. In the United States, Wilson, the president at the time, never made a single public statement of any kind about this pandemic. And in an effort to, there was a concern that Wilson didn't want any bad news about anything, period. He didn't want any news that might hurt morale. This had nothing to do with the pandemic. They created an infrastructure in advance of the pandemic. Again, nothing to do with the pandemic. Something called the Committee for Public Information, a propaganda arm. The architect of that committee said, nothing in experience tells us that truth is superior to falsehood. The only thing that matters is its impact on what you say. So the government created this entity that was geared toward telling lies to keep morale up for the war. The government also passed a law that made it punishable by 20 years in prison to, quote, utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government of the United States. That law was upheld by the Supreme Court by Oliver Wendell Holmes, and an opinion from 2 phrases from that opinion survive. One is, you don't shout fire in a crowded theater, and clear and present danger. And the government enforced that law vigorously. They sent a congressman sentenced to prison for 10 years, a congressman.
You're kidding me.
So
this is the 1980s.
So that's the context. On the one hand, and again, not prior to the pandemic, only because of the war. The government created an institution designed to lie to keep morale up and at the same time punish people for criticizing any action by the government. So that's the context that influenza arrived in. As a result, there's no Tony Fauci in 1918. You had national public health leaders associated with the government saying things like, this is ordinary influenza by another name. It was called Spanish influenza, although it didn't start in Spain. And you have nothing to fear if proper precautions are taken. And yet, people could die less than 24 hours after the first symptoms. And they could die with horrific symptoms. Probably the scariest would be they could bleed not only from their nose and mouth, but from their eyes and ears. That's a pretty frightening symptom. So people are dying in some cases with these horrible symptoms, and in some cases very rapidly, and a lot of people are dying. And the government is telling you this is ordinary influenza by another name. You have nothing to worry about. I could, go into greater detail, but we're going to be talking for a long time.
So if you like this little short clip from an interview I did, click over here to watch the entire interview. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.